See if I even remember how to do this. What's happening, everybody? Justin, Bridgewater's Finest on YouTube, Blockbuster_guy on Twitter, and hey, when I'm wearing this outfit, when I'm wearing this getup, you know exactly what that means, and what that means is NHL playoff prediction time. Now, we're still obviously a few weeks away from the playoffs. Nothing has been solidified as of yet. All divisions are still up for grabs, but we're going to do what we do here every year, and that's we're going to try to get ahead of the curve. That's right. We are going to try to get ahead of who's going to win these divisions, who's going to make the playoffs, and what our first round playoff matchups are going to look like. All set? Let's do this. So this is also going to be a podcast version. I'm just going to take the audio from the video files, put them together, make it a podcast. It's going to be available on SoundCloud and iTunes, but I had to stick with tradition with these. So this is going to be 2 videos on the YouTube channel. First one, obviously, we're going to talk about our division winners for the 2017 NHL season into the 2017 NHL playoffs. That's what this video is going to be. The next video is going to be who makes the playoffs aside from the division winners, who is just going to miss the cut on making the playoffs, who's in, who's out. You know it, you love it. We've been doing it every year. Let's get into it. So we've been actually rather fortunate this season as there's really only one division that's sewn up or close to being sewn up at this point in the season. There's only about 12 to 14 games left for each team. This is right around that wheelhouse where I like to get out and do my predictions. I figure I'm far enough ahead of them that it's still somewhat respectable if I get something right. So let's talk about the one division that's, I guess, the division that's the least in doubt, which means we're going to start in the Western Conference. Let's start in the Pacific Division. And the only teams we're really talking about in terms of who could win the Pacific Division at this point is obviously the division leading San Jose Sharks. Anaheim is still in there. And then the 2 Canadian teams, Edmonton and Calgary. They're still there. They're still fighting for not just a playoff spot, but the division is not completely out of hand. San Jose currently holds a 7-point lead over Anaheim, 8 points over Edmonton, and 9 points over Calgary, which tells you everything you need to know about how tight the rest of that division is. That's 3 teams only separated by 2 points behind the division leaders. This is actually the only division in the NHL that has the distinction of having every team in the division having the exact same number of games remaining on their schedule, which doesn't necessarily help out the teams that are currently behind the leader. Every team in the division has exactly 12 games remaining on their schedule, which means, again, if you're 7, 8, and 9 points back to the division leader, you don't have to win out, but you got to do something special in order to catch them. San Jose has a pair of winnable games left in their schedule in Dallas against the Stars, as well as a very winnable home-and-home with the Vancouver Canucks. That also doesn't help. While I think we have 3 legitimate teams in the Pacific Division to reach triple digits in points, I think you have 3 teams that reach 100 points, and you got a 4th team that's just a bubble. They're going to be right there. I don't think any of them at the end of the day are going to have quite enough to catch the San Jose Sharks. I'm going to predict that the San Jose Sharks are going to hold on to the advantage that they have right now by 7 points and win the Pacific Division. I've got San Jose finishing with 107 points, which won't be good enough for either the President's Trophy or the most points in the Western Conference for a division-winning team, but it will be good enough to win the Pacific. Let's go up to the Central Division now, where things are a little less competitive, at the very least in terms of number of teams who could potentially win this division. Right now, Chicago holds a 3-point edge over Minnesota, and I think those are the only 2 teams we really need to talk about. In terms of the division, Nashville's 14 points behind, St. Louis is 16 points. I don't see either of those 2 teams really catching fire and making up that much of a gap. So let's just focus on Chicago and Minnesota. As I mentioned, Chicago's got a 3-point edge on Minnesota in the division right now. They have 2 more ROWs, regulation and overtime wins, which is a significant tiebreaker in terms of winning, losing divisions, who's in what spot. It's a significant tiebreaker. I believe it's the number 2 and becomes the number 1 tiebreaker since everybody plays the same number of games. So that's the important tiebreaker right there. Chicago has 2 more ROWs than does Minnesota. So in order for Minnesota to catch them, overtake them, they're basically going to have to beat them in points. Minnesota does have 1 game in hand on Chicago at this point in the season, and these two teams do not play each other again for the rest of the regular season. I do think Minnesota does win that extra game in hand that they have on Chicago. That would be a season-ending date in Arizona to take on the Coyotes. That's an extremely winnable game for Minnesota. So I do think they do win that, but I do think they also straight up lose one more game than Chicago does for the rest of the regular season. Minnesota has tough home dates with both the Rangers and the Senators. Those are two very good road teams, and I unfortunately think Minnesota drops both of those games. Their only other real significant home game is a home date with the San Jose Sharks leading the Pacific Division. I do think they win that game, but I think there's a couple of other sort of trap games in there that I think at best Minnesota will only snag a point out of. Meanwhile, you look at Chicago, pretty comfortable home schedule for the rest of the season for Chicago. Of course, Chicago, very difficult building to win in. The only home game I think they out and out drop is their game against Columbus. I think Columbus tops them there. They probably snag a point out of Boston too. Based on the rest of their home games, they probably win out of those home games. On the road, they've got to go to Pittsburgh. That's a really tough game. I think Pittsburgh wins that game. The rest of their road games, again, I think they do pretty solid at. Might be a couple games that go into extras and they only grab a point out of those. But again, they've only really got to do that. Just avoid the regulation losses, and Chicago should be all right here. At the end of the day, I've got both of these teams topping 110 points, but I like the Blackhawks. I'm going to keep Chicago just a little bit above Minnesota and predict that the Chicago Blackhawks will hold on and win the Central Division. Again, both of these teams I think are going to top 110 points. It's going to be close, right down to the wire, but ultimately, I think Chicago holds on. I'll take the Blackhawks to win the Central. See how easy this is? Let's move into the Eastern Conference now and go to the Atlantic Division, my division, the division with my Montreal Canadiens, where they do currently hold the lead in the division, but it's basically by the slimmest of margins. And you look at the Atlantic Division is still really, really competitive. 5 teams within 9 points right now of the division lead, and any of those 5 teams could catch fire and really put pressure on the Montreals and the Ottawas at the top to win this division. This, by the way, is the division that gets really fun once we talk about who's going to and not going to make the playoffs. Montreal currently leads this division at 86 points and 37 ROWs. It's crazy to think if Montreal or Ottawa or whatever, one of these teams was in the Metropolitan Division, which we're going to talk about in a minute, they would be the 5th place team in this division. Montreal leads the Atlantic, 86 points, 37 ROWs. Ottawa only a single point behind at 85 points, only 35 ROWs, and that could really come into play here at the end of the season. Boston only 4 points behind, 36 ROW. And at this point, we can't completely discount the possibility of the Tampa Bay Lightning or the Toronto Maple Leafs winning this division. They're not totally out of it yet. Toronto was actually a huge 5-0 win against Tampa Bay last night, which means they leapfrogged Tampa Bay in the standings. Toronto 78 points, 31 ROW. Tampa Bay 77 points, 30 ROW. The 2 Ontario franchises are the teams that hold the advantage in terms of games in hand. Both Toronto and Ottawa have a game in hand on the division-leading Habs. Montreal at this point has a game in hand only on Boston and has the same number of games left as Tampa Bay. I think realistically, even though they're not mathematically eliminated at this point, I think realistically, Tampa Bay and Toronto are going to be so concerned with each other and where each other are in the standings vis-a-vis the wild card. I don't think either of these teams are thinking about the division right now. We can probably safely eliminate them. Look, I think both of them get to somewhere comfortably in around the mid-90 point area, which has them right in the conversation for one of those wildcard spots. I think it comes down to ultimately one of them's going to get one of them's not going to get one. In terms of the division, I guess we can safely eliminate them, but it is worth pointing out if either one of those teams catch fire, they're not dead in the water in terms of winning this division. So let's really look at the heavy hitters here. Montreal, Ottawa, and Boston. It definitely hurts Boston that Montreal has a game in hand on them, which also means Ottawa has 2 games in hand on them, and Boston currently trails Ottawa by 3 points. That's going to be a really tough mountain to climb for the Bruins. Boston's next game is in Toronto. That's either tonight or tomorrow night. I can't remember which one. I think it's tomorrow night. And that's actually a sneaky game. I actually think the Leafs win that game based on not just it being in Toronto, but again, I just think it's one of those sneaky games. I think it's kind of a trap game, if you want to call it that. So that's close. I think Toronto actually wins that game, and that's really going to hurt Boston as well. But based on Boston's remaining schedule, they have that game in Toronto and a game at home against Nashville. I think those are the only two games they out and out lose for the rest of the regular season. All told, I've only got the Bruins getting to 99 points. I don't have them breaking 100. And the two teams ahead of them, I do have breaking 100 points. So Boston, in terms of winning the division, they're going to be there. And it's going to become right down to the end. But like I say, the two things that are really going to kill them is those two games in hand they give up to Ottawa, the game in hand they give up to Montreal, as well as what I think will be a loss in their next game in Toronto. I think that's really the nail in the coffin in terms of Boston winning the division. All right, Ottawa and Montreal, this is the real competition here. Again, Ottawa only trails Montreal by a point. They've got a game in hand. Montreal's got the extra 2 ROW. Simply put, the Senators have been incredible on the road this season. They're 20-12 straight up, games won, games lost. They're one of only 4 teams in the NHL that's won at least 20 games on the road this season. That's some pretty elite company. Montreal's the better home team between these two. They're the only team in this division that's won at least 20 games at home. These two teams, Montreal and Ottawa, play each other 3 more times in the rest of the regular season. That could really determine who wins the division and who doesn't. I've actually got Ottawa winning 2 of those 3 games. The major difference here may be those are the only 2 games for the rest of their regular season that I have Montreal losing straight up. I think they lose 3 other games aside from those, all on the road, but I think they get points out of those games. Ottawa, to their credit, I think they get a couple of points out of a couple of road games late in the season. They're in Boston and in New York to play the Islanders. I think they get points out of those games, but I think ultimately they lose those games. Ottawa also has a ridiculously difficult home date with the New York Rangers, the best road team in hockey so far this season. And Ottawa, honestly, they're a pretty average home team. In straight up games won and lost, Ottawa's only 19-18 in their own building. Aside from those 2 home games against Ottawa, I think Montreal runs the table at home for the rest of their schedule. They've got a pretty light home game schedule for the rest of the season. Detroit, Carolina, Dallas, Florida. These are all teams that trail them in the standings. These are teams that Montreal needs 2 points out of if they want to win this division. I think the pivotal game that will determine whether or not Montreal wins this division is a home game late in the season against Tampa Bay. Tampa Bay could really play spoiler to Montreal in terms of winning the division. In that game, it's Montreal's second last game of the season. Ultimately, at the end of the day, you crunch the numbers, you do the math. I have both of these teams getting to exactly 103 points, which based on my projections would still make them 5th place in the Metropolitan Division. Isn't that crazy? So I've got both of these teams, as I mentioned, getting to 103 points. I like Montreal to win the division by holding that 1 extra ROW game in hand on Ottawa. I don't think Ottawa makes that up with their remaining schedule. Again, I think Ottawa only loses 3 games in the rest of their regular season schedule straight up, but there's a couple of games in there, a couple of tricky games that I think they lose, maybe grab a point out of. And again, they're going to tie 103 points each. That's what I'm predicting, but I like Montreal to get the division on the tiebreaker. Quite frankly, I'm not going to be brokenhearted if Montreal doesn't win the division. Whoever wins this division has to play one of those Metropolitan teams as the wild card 1, because I don't think anybody in the Atlantic is going to catch them in terms of the wild card 1 spot. So whoever wins this division has to play like the Rangers or Pittsburgh or Columbus or Washington possibly. I don't want to play those teams in the first round, quite frankly. So if Ottawa wins this division, I'm not going to be brokenhearted. But based on the remaining games, crunching the numbers, I like Montreal to win the division on a tiebreaker, 103 points even for each teams. But I like Montreal to win the Atlantic Division. That only leaves us with one more, the Metropolitan Division, arguably the best division in hockey. You got 4 really incredible teams in here and 1 or 2 more that are just kind of on the bubble, but 4 really incredible teams. We're talking about all 4 of them right now in terms of who could possibly win this division. And 2 weeks ago, that would have sounded crazy. Washington had a significant point lead in the standings, and you would have thought, okay, Washington's got this thing sewn up. Look, I even went on record when Washington traded for Shattenkirk and said, well, Washington's going to win the cup. But now we're talking in terms of they might not even win their own division. The standings sit like this. Washington sits with 98 points and 44 ROW. Columbus sits with 96 points, 43 ROW. Pittsburgh, 95 points, only 40 ROW. I think that's really going to kill them. And the Rangers, 90 points, 41 ROW. I think we can safely eliminate the Rangers. That's a lot of points to make up in a short period of time, especially where the Rangers do not have the game in hand advantage in this 4-team competition. That goes to both Columbus and Pittsburgh. They each have a game in hand on Washington and the Rangers. And again, right now, it's an 8-point disadvantage for the Rangers. That's a lot to make up, especially where you're not going to have Lundqvist for probably another week or so. Although, look, Antti Ranta, right? I mean, come on, Antti Ranta playing pretty damn well. But in terms of winning the division, let's safely eliminate the Rangers. So now we're talking about Pittsburgh, Columbus, and Washington. Despite the fact that Pittsburgh's currently sitting at 95 points, it's a pretty mediocre road team. I mean, look, okay, so I shouldn't say mediocre, but based on the numbers, really not the greatest road team out there. 16-19 on the road so far this season, just in straight up wins and losses. They've grabbed some extra points in there, of course, but they've only won 16 of their 35 games so far this season on the road. And where that comes into play, I think Pittsburgh only splits the remaining 6 games that they've got on the road. They got some tough games in there. They got to go into Madison Square Garden and play the Rangers. That's a tough out. They got to go into Ottawa. That's going to be kind of, again, 50-50. As I said, Ottawa hasn't been the greatest home team this year, but Pittsburgh has been, I would argue, a worse road team than Ottawa has been home team. I gave that game to Ottawa. So I think Pittsburgh really only goes 3-3 on the road, and I think if they really want to catch the leaders in this division, it's going to be tough to do that if you don't perform a little bit above expectation on the road. I don't expect that. I've got Pittsburgh comfortably getting to 110 points. I've actually got them at 112, but I do not have Pittsburgh winning this division. Let's look at Washington. I mean, look, Washington's been the dominant team in this division really most of the season, up there with Columbus. But as the season has worn on, Washington really kind of started separating themselves from the pack until the last 2 weeks. And they've really kind of come back to the pack again. Now the advantage, only 2 points. Much like Pittsburgh, Washington, only a mediocre road team. They're 17-17 on the road this season. Perfect, 50-50 in terms of wins and losses. They've got some really winnable road games on their remaining schedule in Colorado, in Arizona. Those are games that Washington is going to win. They can probably snag a point off of Columbus in their game as well, and probably against a team like Toronto. But I think they're going to go into Boston and lose. Their next game, they're going into Tampa Bay. I don't think they win that game. I gave that game to the Lightning. So Washington, they're not going to be, they're not incredible on the road, and I don't think that's going to change for the remainder of the season. The team that I like to win this division is the team that's got a game in hand on Washington, and that's Columbus. I've only got Columbus straight up losing 2 more games on their schedule for the rest of the season. They play Washington twice more. It's a home and home. I think they beat Washington in Columbus and get a point off of Washington in Washington. Columbus been a pretty good road team this year at 19-14, certainly comfortably above 500 on the road. I think they get a point out of Washington in the game in Washington. And having that game in hand, I think that's really what's going to make the difference here. I've got Columbus getting to 115 points and winning the President's Trophy. Columbus wins the President's Trophy, wins the Metropolitan Division only by a single point. I've got Washington getting to 114, but I got Columbus getting to 115 with the 49 ROW, which I believe will tie Washington. I think they also get to 49, but I got Columbus winning the Metropolitan Division, winning the President's Trophy, winning home ice throughout the playoffs. All right, folks, this is where the YouTube video is going to cut off. The SoundCloud episode, of course, will be continuing beyond this point. The YouTube video is going to cut off right here in terms of the division winners. Come back in a minute and take a look at who I think is going to make the playoffs, who's going to miss the playoffs, and what our projected first round playoff matchups will be. Tune in to the who's in, who's out portion of the video. We'll see you again in a minute.